Hey darlings. The new employee found it strange how the stepmother treated her stepson and decided to secretly film it. When the employee gave the recording to the child's father, she was shocked by his reaction in the small town of San Miguel de Allende with its cobblestone streets and colorful houses. The perfect scenario was presented for a new job opportunity for Katia when she crossed the Iron Door of Benito's house, her new boss. The employee felt a mix of anxiety and determination. It was her first day of work. I work in that house, and I wanted to make a good impression inside the house. Emilio, the boss's son, was sitting at the breakfast table drawing circles with the spoon in the cereal bowl. His gaze was empty as if his mind were miles away. Pilar, the stepmother, was standing watching Emilio with an expression of impatience. Emilio, finish your breakfast. You have tasks to complete. You need to have responsibility to do everything you need before playing, Pilar said with a firm and authoritative voice. Katia entered the dining room, exciting but trying to seem confident. Benito, Emilio's father, was next to the table reading the newspaper. He raised his eyes and smiled at Katia. Good morning, Katia. I hope you feel comfortable here. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask, Benito said with a welcoming tone. Katia. She nodded and began to observe the family dynamics. She noticed how Emilio avoided Pilar's gaze, mechanically obeying her orders. Why does he seem so apathetic? Katia thought as she moved around the kitchen, familiarizing herself with the space. Pilar, instructing Emilio on his daily tasks. Emilio, don't forget to tidy up your room and do your homework. I want you to catch up on all your school exercises, Pilar said with the same firmness as before. Emilio nodded without saying a word. Taking the backpack and slowly heading towards the door, Katia watched everything attentively, noticing the tension in the air. A while later, Pilar addressed Katia. Katia, I will need you to take care of cleaning the house and prepare lunch. If you need anything, I am here to help, said Pilar with a tone that she mixed authority and formality. Katia nodded again, endo that there was much more behind that rigid facade of Pilar. As she cleaned the living room, Katia reflected on the interaction she had just witnessed. Benito seemed like a loving father, and Pilar, although severe, she seemed to care for Emilio in some way. But why does he seem so distant and apathetic? Katia thought, remembering Emilio's blank look later during lunch. Benito was trying to create a light atmosphere by talking about the events in the city and trying to involve Pilar in the conversation. Pilar responded politely, but her attention was constantly focused on Emilio, who was eating in silence. Katia served the food, observing every detail. Could Pilar be being fair to Emilio, or am I just misinterpreting? She asked herself as she placed the dinner on the table. At the end of the day, Khan noted Emilio with slumped shoulders and a tired look. Pilar sincerely ready to give more instructions. Emilio takes the trash outside, and don't forget that you will have to cut this week's grass, said Pilar. Emilio nodded and began to pick up the trash without saying anything. Katia from the back of the hallway watched the scene with growing concern as she cleaned the dinner dishes. Katia finally had the opportunity to talk to Pilar. Pilar, for you so hard on Emily asked, having a neutral tone. Pilar stopped for a moment, considering the question. Katia, I'm just trying to do what's best for him, Pilar answered, her voice without any trace of doubt. Benito heard the conversation and approached. Placing a comforting hand on Katia's shoulder, Pilar said, she only wants the best for Emilio. Trust us. Katia nodded, but the worry had not yet disappeared from her heart. I hope they are right, she thought, determined to continue watching and protecting Emilio in the best way she could. The next day, the sun shone brightly while Katia organized the kitchen after breakfast. She couldn't get the interaction from the previous day between Pilar and Emilio. Pilar's severity, out of her mind, seemed unjustified, and Emilio's apathy worried her more and more. I need to take a closer look, Katia thought as she cleaned the counters. She decided to keep a close eye on Pilar and Emilio during the day, seeking to better understand the dynamic between them. Later, while Emilio did his homework in the living room, Pilar approached Emilio. You haven't finished yet, it's late, Pilar said impatiently. Emilio, without raising his head, responded with an almost inaudible murmur. Katia, who was passing through the hallway, stopped discreetly too, observing She noticed how she kept a severe gaze fixed on Emilio, who seemed to shrink under her presence. Why is she always so hard on him? Katia thought, feeling a pang of sadness for Emilio during lunch. The tension was palpable. Emilio barely touched the food while Pilar watched him. With critical eyes, Emilio, eat your food, you need energy to grow, said Pilar with a softer, but still authoritative tone of voice. Emilio nodded slowly and began to eat, avoiding Pilar's gaze. Katia served the table, sensing every detail of the interaction. Something is wrong here, Katia reflected while collecting the empty plates. In the afternoon, Benito came home from work with a smile on his face and a gift in his hands for Emilio. Look what I brought you, son, Benito said, handing over a small toy. Emilio. He smiled, his face illuminated by a brief moment of joy. Pilar observed from afar, his lips pursed in a thin line. You still need to fix your things for tomorrow. Emilio finishes looking at the gift, and go fix your things, said the stepmother. Making the boy shrink, the boy murmured in a complaining tone as he observed the tension in the family. Katia felt more and more worried. Come on, Emilio, don't give your stepmother a job. See the gift before doing what she is asking, Benito said. Perceiving Pilar's expression, Katia, observing the scene, felt a growing confusion. Why does Benito always try to appease Pilar? She asked herself internally. Later, Pilar called Emilio to her room. Emilio, you need to fix this room. It's a mess, she ordered. Emilio sighed and began to organize her things. Katia, who was cleaning the hallway, listened to the dialogue and discreetly decided. Why are you always giving me orders? Emilio asked with a voice full of frustration. Pilar responded quickly, because I want you to be a good boy. Man, when you grow up, Emilio. Katia stood for a moment, reflecting on Pilar's words. At night, as everyone prepared for dinner, Katia noticed that Emilio seemed more withdrawn than usual. Pilar, on the other hand, was especially critical of everything Emily did. Emilio, wash your hands properly. You're old enough to know that, said Pilar with a tone of voice that bordered on exasperation. Benito tried to relieve the tension as always. Let's go, Emilio, do what you want, stepmother is asking. She only wants the best for you, said Benito, trying to sound conciliatory. Katia watched, becoming more and more convinced that there was something deeply wrong. During dinner, the conversation was minimal. Pilar maintained a rigid control over the table, correcting Emilio on every little slip. Don't talk with your mouth full, Emilio, sit up straight, finish all the vegetables. Each correction made Emilio cringe. Music? He looked so unhappy she thought she was struggling to find a way to help. After dinner, Katia helped clean the kitchen while Pilar and Benito talked in the living room. Emilio had been sent to his room to finish his schoolwork. Katia, while she was washing the dishes, she thought about how to approach Pilar. She knew that he needed to better understand the dynamic between them. Suddenly, he heard an argument in the living room. Pilar was talking to Benito. Her tone was low but firm. He needs to learn to be more responsible. We can't let him grow up without discipline, Pilar said, clearly irritated. Benito sighed, trying to keep it together. Calm down, Pilar, he is just a child. We need to be more patient, Benito responded, his voice full of concern. Katia dried her hands and approached the door, listening carefully, and opened it slightly to see what was happening. Pilar. She continued, now more excited. Benito, you are very soft with him. If we are not tough now, he will never learn, she said. Benito got up and put a hand on Pilar's shoulder. Let's give him a break. We all need to breathe, Benito said, trying to calm the situation. Returning to the kitchen, Katia decided that it was time to intervene, but in a subtle way. While she was organizing the dishes, she thought, how can I help without causing more tension? Katia asked herself. She knew she needed to choose her words and her timing well. The next day, Katia did not have time to talk to Pilar since she had gone to visit some relatives. Emilio was sitting on the sofa with a sketchbook in his lap, scribbling absent-mindedly. Benito, watching his son, sat next to him with a calm smile. Katia, who was organizing some books on the shelf, she watched the interaction carefully. She knew that Benito had a special touch with Emilio. something that was missing in Pilar. Benito really cares about Emilio, Katia thought as she surreptitiously paid attention to the conversation. Benito leaned closer to Emilio, trying to make eye contact. Emilio, you are fine, you can tell me anything, I will always be here for you, Benito said with a soft and comforting voice. Emilio stopped drawing for a moment and looked at his father. I'm just tired, he responded with a heavy sigh. Katia, upon hearing that, she felt a momentary relief. At least Emilio had someone to trust in Benito. Katia continued organizing the books, but she couldn't help but feel a growing admiration. For Benito, he is a great father, always trying to do the best for Emilio thought. He decided it was time to express his thoughts. Benito, you are a great father, Emilio. He is lucky to have you, said Katia with sincerity. Benito smiled and thanked, but there was a shadow of worry in his. He knew with his eyes that something was disturbing Emilio, and that made him deeply uncomfortable. As the afternoon progressed, Benito suggested that they play a board game. Emilio accepted and Katia joined them, creating an atmosphere of lightness and relaxation during the game. Benito, he continued encouraging Emilio, praising his skills and strategies. You're doing very well, Emilio. Keep it up, Benito said enthusiastically. Emilio wasn't smiling. He was still apathetic, but he was playing during a break in the game. Emilio went to get a glass of water. Katia took the opportunity to talking to Benito. It seems like he is enjoying the game in his own way, commented Katia. Benito nodded, but couldn't hide his concern. I know, Katia, but I feel like he is very apathetic. I want to help him, but he needs to feel safe to open up, he responded. Benito sighed when Emilio returned. Katia decided to let the father and son play alone. She needed to go back to work. Benito suggested they watch a movie together. Emilio chose an animation, and they settled on the couch ready to enjoy family time. Katia, while she watched the interaction between father and son, felt a renewed hope. Perhaps over time, Emilio will feel more comfortable sharing what is bothering him, she thought, determined to continue offering her support as the film progressed. Developed, Benito took the opportunity to bring Emilio closer, hugging him with affection. Genuine, remember, Emilio, I am your father, and I want the best for you, Benito whispered. Emilio only nodded, but the expression on his face was distracted. Katia, watching the scene, felt a warmth in her heart. This family has its difficulties, but also a lot of love, he reflected. When the movie ended, Emilio was visibly more relaxed. Benito stood up and stretched, smiling at Katia. Thank you for being here, Katia. Your presence makes a big difference, he said. Katia smiled back, feeling valued. It's a pleasure, Benito. We are all here for Emilio's sake, she responded with a renewed sense of commitment. As the night fell, Benito suggested that everyone go to sleep early. Tomorrow is a new day, and we will face it together, he said with determination. Emily went up the stairs with a slight smile, feeling a little lighter. Katia finished tidying up the living room, reflecting on the day. Benito, he is truly a dedicated father. With your help, Emilio can overcome anything obstacle, she thought, determined to continue observing and supporting the family in the best way possible. The next day, Katia, who was going up the stairs to check on her, stopped at the open door, observing the child sitting on the bed with a toy in his lap. He seemed lost in thought, watching the toy without playing. Katia took a deep breath, determined to try to talk to him.
Emilio, can uno come in?
She asked softly. Emilio raised his head and nodded slightly, indicating that he could. Katia came in and sat on the edge of the bed. Looking at Emilio's tired face, you seem sad lately. Is everything fine? She asked, trying to sound casual, but with genuine concern in the voice. Emilio sighed, looking away. I'm fine, Katia. Don't worry, he responded with a low and resigned voice. Katia noticed the lack of energy and joy that is normally expected from a child his age. Silence settled in the room for a few moments while Katia thought about the best way to continue the conversation. She knew that she needed to be patient and show Emilio that he could trust her. You know, Emilio, sometimes it is good to talk about what we are feeling. It can help alleviate the weight, said Katia, looking at him tenderly. Emilio gave a slight smile, but his eyes continued avoiding eye contact. I know, Katia, but I'm well. Really? He insisted. Although his voice was not convincing, Katia decided to change her tactics. "Emilio, if you need anything, I'm here," she said, trying to convey as much security as possible. Emilio finally looked at her, his eyes full of something that seemed like be a mixture of sadness and fear. "Thank you, Katia," he murmured. Katia felt a tightening in her heart as she realized that Emilio was clearly hiding something, but he was not ready to open up completely. She got up and started to fix some things in the room, giving Emilio time to process her thoughts. Emilio, when she was little, also had many fears and worries, and it was difficult to find someone with whom she could talk. Katia shared in the hope of creating a closer bond. Close with him, Emilio watched her for a moment, seeming to consider her words. "I understand, Katia. Sometimes it's hard," he said, finally admitting a bit of his own struggle. The atmosphere in the room began to seem a little lighter, but Katia knew there was still a lot to do. Emilio wasn't saying, "I'm here to help you." "Emilio, you can trust me," Katia reinforced, wanting to ensure that he felt safe. Emilio gave a small smile, but he still seemed distant. "I know, Katia. You're very good to me," he said. Grateful but still reluctant, Katia sat again on the edge of the bed, trying to convey calm and support. "You are a very strong boy, Emilio, and I know you are going through something difficult, but I want you to know that you are not alone," she said firmly and lovingly. Emilio sighed again, seeming to fight against his own emotions. "Thank you, Katia. I will be fine," he replied, but his voice betrayed the uncertainty he felt. As Katia prepared to leave the room, she decided to try one last time. "Emilio, sometimes we need time to open up, and that's perfectly normal. Just know that you can count on me when you're ready," she said, smiling gently. Emilio nodded, appreciating Katia's understanding and patience. "Thank you for understanding, Katia," he said, showing a little more confidence. Katia left the room, but her mind, she was full of worries. "He is hiding something important, something that is hurting him," she thought, determined to find out what was happening so she could help. She knew she needed to gain trust. She was willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure his well-being. The next morning, Katia decided to go up to Emilio's room to check on him. Pilar had gone out to resolve some affairs, and Benito was busy in the office. Katia, still reflecting on the decision to film Pilar, felt that there was something deeper that needed to be discovered. When she arrived at the door of Emilio's room, she knocked softly before. "If Emilio comes in, can I come in?" she asked, trying not to alarm the boy. Emilio was sitting on the bed looking through a school book, but his gaze was distant. He nodded slowly, allowing Katia to come in. She approached and sat next to him, noticing that he was a little more withdrawn than normal. "Emilio, how are you feeling?" asked Katia, looking for some sign of opening. Emilio shrugged his shoulders, avoiding eye contact. "I'm fine, Katia," he answered, but there was something in his voice that didn't convince Katia. While they were talking, Katia noticed a slight purple stain on Emilio's arm. Her heart raced, and she approached to look closer. "Emilio, what are those marks on your body?" Katie asked, her voice full of worry. Emilio tried to hide his arm, but Katia gently held her hand, insisting, "Is nothing, Katia. I fell," said Emilio, his voice trembling and unconvincing. Katia felt a wave of worry and anger. She knew that Emilio was not telling the truth. "Emilio, you can trust me. Who did this to you?" asked Katia, looking into the eyes of the boy. Emilio bit his lip in doubt. "I can't say it, Katia. Just leave me alone," she responded, looking away again. Katia knew that she needed to gain Emilio's trust so that he would open up, but the sight of the marks on his body left her distraught, determined to protect her. "Emilio," Katia tried a different approach. "Emilio, I know it's difficult, but I'm here to help you. I promise no one will hurt you anymore," she said, her voice full of determination. Emilio looked at her for a moment, his eyes shining with tears contained. "I want to believe in you, Katia, but it's complicated," he said, finally revealing a little of his vulnerability. Katia felt a squeeze in her heart. Seeing the pain in Emilio's eyes, she knew she needed to act quickly, but without scaring him even more. "Emilio, trust me, let's solve this together," said Katia, trying to convey confidence and security. Emilio nodded slowly, still reluctant but beginning to trust Katia a little more. "It's okay, Katia. I'll try," he answered with a heavy sigh. While Katia left the room, she couldn't Stop thinking about the marks on Emilio's body and the sadness in his eyes. I need to discover the truth and protect Emilio, she thought, determined. She knew that Pilar seemed to be the culprit, but she needed more evidence to confront her and involve Benito in the situation. Katia, she decided that she would do whatever was necessary to prove what was happening in that house to protect the child. The next day the house was in its usual rhythm. Katia, still affected by the marks she saw on Emilio's body, knew she needed to act. She quickly spent the night planning how to discreetly install cameras around the house with Benito and Pilar busy finding the perfect moment to put her plan into action. I need to do this for Emilio, thought Katia, determined to discover the truth. Katia began in the living room, carefully positioning the first camera on a high shelf hidden among the books. Her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted the angle. I hope this works, she muttered to herself, checking the display on her phone. Satisfied, she moved to the kitchen where she placed another camera in a discreet corner. Each noise made her heart race, but she remained determined while installing the cameras. Katia reflected on the marks she had seen on Emilio's arm. The purple stains were clear evidence that something was very wrong. I can't ignore this. Emilio needs help, Katia thought, feeling a wave of anger and sadness. She knew that Pilar was severe, but those marks indicated that the situation was more serious than she thought. It seemed Katia decided to place one more camera in the hallway near Emilio's room where many of the interactions occurred. With all the cameras installed, Katia returned to her room to verify the images. The cameras were working perfectly, capturing all the critical areas of the house. Katia felt a mixture of relief and apprehension now. We just have to wait, she thought, anxious about what the recordings would reveal. She knew that this was just the beginning of a complicated journey, but she was ready to face any situation. Something to protect Emilio. In the following days, Katia carefully monitored the recordings. She saw Pilar reprimanding Emilio several times, but she had not yet caught anything that would explain the marks. Each interaction between Pilar and Emilio seemed full of tension. I will be losing something, Katia wondered, worried about the possibility that Pilar was even more careful in hiding her actions. One afternoon while Emilio was at school, Katia reviewed the most recent recordings. She saw Pilar entering Emilio's room and speaking to him in a harsh manner, but nothing that suggested physical violence. Yet Pilar's rigidity and Emilio's submissive reaction were evident. I need something more concrete, thought Katia, determined to continue watching. That same day while Pilar and Emilio were in the living room, Katia, he carefully observed the interactions between the stepmother and the stepson. He could barely pay attention to the work he had to do due to his concern for the child. Emilio was sitting on the couch trying to do the homework task while Pilar walked back and forth, her expression stern. Emilio, you need to follow the rules, Pilar ordered, her voice sharp. Emilio raised his eyes from the notebook with a mixture of fear and frustration. Why didn't you like it? He asked, the sadness evident in his voice. Katia hidden behind the kitchen door. He watched the scene with a heavy heart. He knew he needed to capture these interactions to show Benito the true nature of what was happening, while Pilar continued to berate him. Emilio, Katia tried to hide his attentive observation, so as not to give any indication that could alert Pilar that he was paying attention to the violence that she was suddenly committing. Benito entered the room, sensing the tension between Pilar and Emilio. He approached his son, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Calm down, son. Your stepmother only wants the best for you, said Benito, trying to alleviate the situation. Emilio looked at his father with eyes full of despair, but he nodded slowly. Katia, seeing what was happening, felt a lump in his throat. She really believes that Pilar is doing the right thing, she thought, worried about Benito's blindness. Pilar continued walking around the room, her posture rigid and imposing. Emilio, if you don't follow the rules, you will never learn to be responsible, she said with a tone of voice that made it clear that you don't. Accepted excuses. Emilio lowered his head, murmuring an answer that Katia could not hear. As the afternoon progressed, Katia saw Pilar constantly criticizing Emilio for small mistakes. each comment loaded with harshness. Emilio 4. Katia felt a mixture of anger and sadness when she saw the impact that Pilar had on the boy. This has to stop, she thought, more determined than ever to protect Emilio. The night fell, and the tension in the house, it seemed to increase. Katia continued reviewing the recordings, noting the most critical moments. In one of those moments, Pilar grabbed Emilio's arm tightly. Emilio tried to withdraw his arm, but Pilar held him firmly. Katia felt a wave of panic and anger when she saw the scene. She is hurting him, she thought. Her heart was racing. Katia knew she needed to do something about it. She couldn't wait any longer. So the employee turned off the recordings and prepared for what was to come. She knew that the situation demanded decisive action, and she was ready to face the consequences. Consequences. Pilar must be stopped, and Benito needs to see the truth, she thought as she formulated a plan determined to do the right thing. Katia took a deep breath, ready for the next step in her mission to protect Emilio. Katia knew who had to act quickly. With the recordings ready, decided to show Benito what was really happening in the house when he was not around, taking advantage of a moment when Pilar was away and Emilio was at school. Katia went to Benito's office with her heart beating hard. He knocked on the door. Benito raised his eyes from the computer, surprised to see Katia there. "What's wrong?" Katia asked him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Benito, you need to see this," Katie said in a firm but nervous voice. Benito frowned but nodded, indicating for her to enter. Katia approached the table, took her phone, and began to search for the recordings she wanted to show. Benito watched her every movement, clearly intrigued. "What is so urgent?" Katia asked, he trying to understand the seriousness of the situation. Katia found the video she needed, and she put the phone in front of Benito. He pressed play, and the images began to roll. Benito's expression quickly changed from curiosity to shock. He saw Pilar holding his arm of Emilio forcefully while the boy tried to break free from his stepmother's grip. Every second that passed seemed like an eternity. When the video ended, Benito was pale with his gaze fixed on the screen. Suddenly, Benito exploded in fury. "How dare you invade our privacy?" This Katia took a step back, scared by Benito's violent reaction. "I just wanted to show what was happening with Emilio," Katia tried to explain, her voice trembling. Benito, however, was out of his mind. "Yes, I invaded our privacy. This is inadmissible. You are fired," Katia shouted, pointing at the door. Katia felt a wave of shock and despair. "Benito, please think about Emilio. He is suffering. Pilar is hurting him," she implored, trying to stay calm. "Benito, however, I didn't want to hear 'Get out of my house now.'" "Katia, you're fired," her voice shouted, echoing in the office. Katia, feeling tears welling up in her eyes, she knew that arguing more would be of no use. She turned around and she left the office, her heart heavy. As Katia crossed the hallway, she heard the front door open. Pilar entered the house with Emilio at her side. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Pilar looked at Katia, curiously sensing that something was wrong. "What is happening here?" she asked Pilar, her impersonal tone of voice. Emilio, feeling the tension, squeezed Pilar's hand, her eyes full of fear and confusion. Katia, trying to control her emotions, she stopped and looked at Pilar. "You are hurting Emilio. Pilar, and Benito is not. She wants to see the truth," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. Pilar narrowed her eyes, her gaze full of contempt. "You don't know what you're talking about, Katia. It's better that you stop saying what you don't know," Pilar responded with terrifying calm. Emilio, seeing the intensity of the situation, she began to cry silently. Katia felt a wave of despair and sadness when she saw Emilio start to cry. The boy, still holding Pilar's hand, looked at Benito with a mixture of fear and determination. Pilar, visibly tense, tried to calm Emilio, but he let go of his hand, taking a step back. "Pilar did nothing. The real monster is you, Dad," Emilio shouted, his voice echoing in the room. Emilio's scream reverberated in the air, leaving everyone in the room stunned. Katia looked at the child in disbelief. "Emilio, "What are you saying?" she asked. Her voice trembling. Pilar next to her looked at Benito with an expression of shock and disbelief. "Benito, is this true?" the stepmother questioned, her tone loaded with tension. Benito, visibly affected, tried to maintain his composure, but his face showed a mixture of anger and panic. "This is absurd, Emilio. Stop lying," Benito shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. But Emilio, with tears running down his face, he didn't back down. "I'm not lying. You always do this when Pilar is not at home. You hurt me," Emilio shouted, his voice full of pain and frustration. Katia, shocked, felt the ground open under her feet. "My God, how did I not realize it before?" she thought, trying to process the revelation. Pilar, still processing Emilio's words, took a step back as if the truth had hit her. "Physically, Benito, tell me this is not true," Benito asked, his voice almost a whisper, now clearly desperate. He tried to approach Pilar, but she raised her hand, preventing me. "Until you explain what is happening," Pilar said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Emilio sobbing. He continued talking. "He always waits for you to leave to work. Pilar then comes to my room and hurts me. I'm afraid of him." Emilio's words were like stabs in Katia's heart. She never imagined that Benito could be the one true culprit. "How could I have been so blind?" I thought, feeling deep sadness and guilt for not having realized it sooner. Benito, now in despair, he looked at Pilar and Katia with pleading eyes. "You have to believe me. Emilio is confusing things. I would never hurt my own son," he said, but his voice lacked of the conviction necessary to dispel the doubts. Pilar, still shocked, looked at Katia in search of some confirmation or denial. Katia, with tears in her eyes, knew that she could not remain silent. "Benito, I saw the marks on the body of Emilio. Knew something was wrong, but I never imagined it was you," she said, her voice full of sadness and anger. Benito took a step back, visibly affected by the accusation. "This is a misunderstanding. Pilar, you have to believe me," she implored. But Pilar was frozen, not knowing who to believe. Tension in the room was unbearable. Pilar finally broke the silence. "Benito, I don't want to hear more from you. How could you do this to your own son?" said, her voice cold and determined as she pulled Emilio's arms, revealing the marks that now they were almost healing. Benito tried to argue, but the determination on Pilar's face made it clear that there was no room for more lies. Katia, still in a state of shock, knew that the truth had finally come to light, but the emotional cost for Emilio and for everyone in the family house would be immense. While Benito tried to find answers, Katia approached Emilio, wrapping him in a protective hug. "Everything is going to be okay, Emilio. I promise you that we are going to protect you," she whispered, trying to comfort Emilio, still crying. He held. Katia felt strongly for the first time that someone really understood him and was willing to protect him. Pilar stood for a moment, watching the scene with tears in her eyes. She knew that her life would never be the same again, but she was determined to do whatever was necessary to guarantee Emilio's safety and well-being. "We will get through this together, Emilio. I promise you," she said, approaching and joining the hug. The truth had been revealed, and now everyone needed to deal with the consequences. Revelation had left everyone in shock. Pilar, without wasting any more time, took her phone and went to the kitchen to call the police. As soon as she heard what his wife was doing, Benito, he started to run to escape, but Katia couldn't stop him. Emilio needed her, the child. She was trembling with fear because of the situation. Her entire body seemed tremulous, and she was about to faint at any moment. "Emilio, calm down. We are going to solve this. Everything is going to be okay. Now we know the truth and we will protect you," she said, trying to calm the child by placing her hands to support him. Pilar, meanwhile, she spoke quickly on the phone, her voice firm and urgent. "Hello, police. We need help immediately," she said. While Pilar was talking to the police, Katia knew she needed to find more evidence. As soon as Emilio's breathing returned to normal, Katia was dispatched determinedly to review the recordings in search of any image that showed Benito hurting Emilio. With trembling hands, he connected his phone to the computer and began to review the videos. Emilio, still affected, followed Katia until the office, his eyes full of fear. "Katia, I'm afraid, he said, his voice trembling. Katia stopped for a moment and looked at Emilio. Everything is going to be okay, Emilio, I promise you, she said, trying to convey to the child. Emilio nodded, but his expression showed that he was terrified. Katia turned her attention to the recordings, desperately searching for any evidence that could help protect Emilio. Pilar entered the room holding Emilio's hand. The police are on their way. They will help us, she said. Her voice was firm but comforting. While Katia reviewed the videos, one of them caught her attention. Was a recent recording that showed Benito entering Emilio's room when Pilar was not at home. She saw him with her heart in her hand, watching Benito approach Emilio in a threatening manner. The image clearly showed Benito seriously injuring Emilio, confirming the boy's accusations. My God, it's true, Katia thought, feeling a wave of nausea. Katia wasted no time. She downloaded the video and sent it to her phone, ready to hand it over to the police. Police, Pilar, I found the proof. We have the video, she said with a firm voice. Pilar looked at the video on Katia's phone, her eyes filling with tears of rage and sadness. How could she do this? She murmured in disbelief. Emilio saw Pilar's expression. He started to cry again, but this time feeling a little safer. The minutes that followed were of almost unbearable tension. Everyone was waiting for the arrival of the police with a heavy heart. Emilio, still afraid, did not let go of Katia's hand. I don't want her to come back, he whispered. Emilio's words were full of dread. Katia squeezed his hand gently, promising that they would do everything possible to protect him. He would never be alone again. Emilio, she said with determination. Finally, the sound of the siren was heard in the distance. Pilar took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, while the police arrived at the house. Katia prepared the video and the recordings, ready to hand them over to the authorities. When the police knocked on the door, Pilar quickly opened the door, explaining the situation with her voice still shaking with emotion. Please come in. We have evidence that my husband is seriously hurting his son, she said, her voice firm. A few blocks from the house, the police found Benito trying to jump a fence to escape. Mr. Benito, he is arrested, said one of the police officers with an authoritative voice. Benito, in panic, he turned towards them, his hands raised in a gesture of desperation. They can't do this. I'm innocent, he shouted, his voice full of fear. But the police were determined. They approached, handcuffing Benito while he tried to resist. The police took Benito back to the house so that Pilar and Katia could confirm that he was the suspect of hurting his own son. When Emilio arrived, still holding Katia's hand, he watched the scene with wide eyes and saw his father being taken to the house. Then for confirmation, and despite the fear, he felt a deep relief. It was he hurt me. He broke my leg once, Emilio murmured, his voice full of sadness and relief at the same time. Katia squeezed his hand, showing her silent support. Pilar, watching the scene, he felt a mixture of anger and relief when he saw that Benito would pay for what he had done. While the police brought Ado back to the house, Pilar approached him, her expression full of determination. It was the officer. This man hurt this child. It had been a while, hurting his son, and I never thought that Benito was capable of that. Several times the child had some fracture. I thought they were normal children's injuries. I never imagined that he could hurt the child so seriously, she said. Suddenly nervous, Pilar turned to Benito. Determination, don't ever appear in Emilio's life again. I don't want you in our lives anymore, she said, her voice cold and firm. Benito tried to argue, but the determination on Pilar's face made it clear that there was no room for more lies. This is a misunderstanding, Benito shouted, but his words no longer had weight. Pilar looked directly into Benito's eyes. You are never going to hurt Emilio again. I am going to make sure that you pay for everything you have done, she said. Her voice was full of anger and determination. Benito now silently, he lowered his head, realizing that his lies had come to an end. Emilio, still holding Katia's hand, looked at Pilar and for the first time felt a true sense of security. Katia knelt next to him, assuring him that everything would be okay. We will get through this together, Emilio. I promise, she said, while Pilar nodded. showing that despite everything, the family was determined to stand up and protect Emilio from any harm. The house was enveloped in palpable tension while Benito was taken away by the police as soon as possible. They left. The room seemed filled with a tense silence. Pilar approached the stepson and hugged him, showing him that he was now safe. Katia, still dealing with the wave of emotions and revelations, felt that it was time to clear things up with Pilar. The previous night had been a whirlwind, and now it was time to face the truth. Pilar looked at Katia with a mixture of sadness and determination. I never imagined that you would think that I mistreated my stepson. He is like a son to me. I could never hurt him. I know I am. Demanding I teach him about responsibilities, and I don't always tell him what he would like to hear. I educate him by teaching him what he needs like his mother would. If she were alive, said Pilar, her voice trembling slightly. Katia felt a knot in her heart. All this time, she had suspected Pilar, believing that she was the source of Emilio's suffering. Now the truth was clear, and the guilt weighed on his shoulders. I am very sorry for having doubted you, Pilar, Katia said, her words full of regret. She could not help the tears that ran down her cheeks. Her face. Pilar nodded, understanding the difficult position in which Katia had found herself. I understand it, Katia. I realized a long time ago that Emilio had more and more injuries, but since children run and fall while playing, I thought it was just that. I never thought that the Emilio's father did something like that, so the only one to blame for this is me, answered Pilar, trying to alleviate the guilt that Katia felt. Benito is not the only one to blame. He is the only one who can take the blame for his actions, Katia answered, exchanging a knowing look with the woman he had so wrongly accused. Emilio holding Pilar and Katia's hand, he looked at them both with gratitude in his eyes. Thank you for believing me, he said, his voice still weak but filled with a new kind of strength. Pilar squeezed his hand with tenderness. We will always believe in you, Emilio, and we will always do our best to protect you, said Pilar, her voice firm and full of love. Katia, trying to regain her composure, felt like she needed to apologize again. Pilar didn't think. When I saw the marks on Emilio, I thought you were the one. Guilty, I'm sorry, she confessed, her voice low and full of regret. Pilar sighed deeply. I understand, Katia. It was a horrible situation for all of us, but now we know the truth and we can move on, said Pilar, her voice soft but determined. Katia, I need you to know that I always did my best to take care of Emilio Benito. He was always very careful in what he did, and I never suspected him. I never imagined that he could be capable of something so cruel, Pilar said, her words full of sadness. Katia felt a mixture of anger and sadness for what Emilio had gone through. I wish I had realized it sooner. I wish I had done more to protect him, Pilar confessed, her voice full of pain. Katia nodded, understanding the weight of the guilt that Pilar felt. We all do the best we can in the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Pilar, the important thing is that now we are here for Emilio, and we are going to make sure that he never suffers again, replied the employee. Emilio, still processing everything that was happening, looked at Pilar and Katia with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. I just want all of this to end. I want to feel safe again, he said, his voice soft and full of desire for pause. Pilar hugged him affectionately. We will do everything possible to make you feel safe, Emilio. I promise you, she said with determination. With Benito outside the house, the atmosphere began to change. Pilar, Katia, and Emilio finally felt like they could begin to breathe easier. Katia looked at Pilar and Emilio, feeling a new wave of determination. We are in this together, Emilio, and no matter what happens, we are going to protect you, Katia said, her voice firm and full of conviction. The atmosphere in the house began to change. Despite all the trauma, there was a feeling of hope and determination between Pilar, Katia, and Emilio. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but they were ready to face it together. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to rebuild their lives based on the trust and love they shared. Sometime later, the sun shone softly on the house, bringing a new beginning for Pilar, Emilio, and Katia. The atmosphere was Different now, lighter and full of hope. Benito's absence was felt, but there was also a palpable relief. Katia, sitting at the kitchen table, watched Emilio playing in the garden with a smile on her face. She is starting to behave like a child again, she thought, satisfied. Pilar entered the kitchen bringing a tray with juices and cookies. It's so good to see Emilio smile again, she said, placing the tray on the table. Katia nodded, her eyes shining with happiness. Yes, he is finally recovering, and I will always be here to help you, Katie answered, her voice full of conviction. Pilar smiled, feeling deep gratitude. We are a family now, Katia stated. Pilar, her voice full of emotion. Emilio, hearing the conversation, ran into the kitchen with a sparkle in his eyes that had been there for a long time. You couldn't see it. I feel happier with you, he said, his smile lighting up the atmosphere. Pilar brought out a chair for him to sit with him, and Katia extended her hand to caress his hair. And you will always be safe, Emilio. We promise, Katia said with renewed determination. In the months that followed, the house began to fill with laughter and joy. Pilar and Katia worked together to create a welcoming and safe environment for Emilio. He began to have more confidence at school and at home. His performance visibly improved. Every little victoria was celebrated with enthusiasm, and Emilio began to open up more about his feelings and experiences. He is becoming the child he should always have been, Pilar thought excitedly when she decided judicially that Pilar would have custody of Emilio. Safety and relief was guaranteed for the child. The celebration at home was full of laughter and tears of joy. Katia prepared a special dinner, and everyone gathered around the table sharing stories and dreams for the future. So proud of you, Emilio, said Katia, raising a toast with juice. Pilar, with tears in her eyes, added, you are the reason why we fought so hard, and it was worth every effort, she said, Emilio feeling completely accepted and loved. He looked at Pilar and Katia with a smile that said more than words could express. Thank you for believing in me and protecting me. I love you, he said, his voice full of sincerity and gratitude. Pilar and Katia approached him, wrapping him in a warm hug. We love you too, Emilio. They responded together, feeling that they had finally found peace and happiness as a true family. As the night progressed, the house was filled with a special warmth, a feeling of belonging and security that had been missing for so long. Katia looking at Emilio and Pilar, she felt a wave of gratitude for having been part of this day. We are exactly where we should be, she thought, satisfied. Pilar at her side looked at Katia with a knowing smile. Emilio is my family, Katia, and you who have been by our side on the other hand. During these months you are also part of this family. We have gained a lot with your arrival here. I have no way to thank you for everything you have done in these last few months. Furthermore, everything was solved thanks to your attentive look. Thank you very much for everything, he stated. Pilar, your voice full of emotion. It is a privilege for me to work with you and have you as a family. I am also grateful to have you by my side, Katia responded, smiling, with custody guaranteed and the brightest future. Emilio began to flourish, regained his self-confidence, and he began to make new friends at school. Pilar and Katia encouraged him every step of the way, celebrating every small achievement. The house that was previously a place of fear and uncertainty was transformed into a home full of love and laughter. It's the beginning of a new life, Pilar thought, finally feeling at peace. In the following days, the routine in the house became more stable. Pilar and Katia continued to work together, making sure that Emilio had everything he needed to grow up happy and healthy. Each day brought new things, hopes and dreams for the small family. Emilio, increasingly confident, began to explore his interests and abilities, knowing that he had the unconditional support of Pilar and Katia at the end of another day full of activities and laughter. Pilar, Katia, and Emilio met in the living room. The sun was setting, and the soft afternoon light came through the window, bathing them in a golden glow. Katia looked at the two and smiled, feeling part of something very special. We will always be here each other for the other. That is our promise, she said with a firm voice full of love. We are a family now, Katia, and with your help we know that everything will be fine, Pilar responded, squeezing Katia's hand. Emilio, between the two of them, felt a sense of belonging and security. Like never before. I have the best family in the world, he exclaimed, his voice full of confidence and joy. And so, with a heart full of hope, the new family began to build a bright future together. If you like this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We greatly appreciate having you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.